Welcome to the Modern Mexico Podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about how Mexico's tortilla industry is under threat from organized crime. In the state of Morelos, just outside of Mexico City, tortilla-makers are complaining about how local organized crime groups are threatening and extorting them. More broadly, politicians and police are struggling to deal with a splintering roster of organized crime groups that are diversifying away from drug trafficking and into a variety of new rackets, including extortion, hijacking cargo trucks, and stealing lumber. One of the biggest challenges that Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum will face is whether or not she can improve security and reduce violent crime in places such as Morelos. Morelos still enjoys a reputation as a leisurely weekend destination for wealthy Mexico City residents and tourists, and this reputation hasn't really been updated to account for the fact that Morelos is now one of the worst hotspots for organized crime activity and violence in Mexico. In 2009, at the start of former President Felipe Calderon's presidency, news crews from around the world came to Morelos after Mexican Marines killed a top narco kingpin in the capital city of Cuernavaca. CBS News covered that incident.
The shootout between Mexican special forces and a small army of heavily armed drug gangsters ricocheted through the streets of Cuernavaca, Mexico for 4 hours. As troops moved in on a luxury condominium in this resort city just south of Mexico City. When the smoke cleared, one of Mexico's most wanted, powerful, ruthless drug lords, Arturo Beltran Leyva, was dead.
But over the last decade and a half, the security dynamic in Morelos has steadily deteriorated, but the English language press hasn't really paid a lot of attention to the problems in Morelos. Local reporters, however, continue to bravely document the crisis. A Mexican TV news channel, TV Azteca, recently broadcast a report calling Cuernavaca a lost paradise.
Morelos, hoy con muchísimos problemas de inseguridad, de corrupción, dos temas que afectan al Estado que se veía que era sin duda un paraíso.
Security analysts speculate that there are now over a dozen organized crime groups operating in Morelos. On today's podcast, we're speaking to Washington Post journalist Mary Beth Sheridan, who recently published an article about how organized crime groups are targeting tortilla-makers in Morelos. Hi, Mary Beth. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here, Nate. Thanks.
So I wanted to start off by asking you, what's one word that you would pick to describe the security dynamic in Morelos?
You know, I think I'd say worrying, and I would say this both about Morelos and honestly the broader security picture in Mexico. I think one of the things that people, particularly in the US, often miss is how much the problem has grown beyond drug trafficking. What we see in Morelos is an example of how organized crime groups increasingly are trying to control territory and how they are becoming ever more important players in the economy, both legal and illegal. So they're really trying to control towns so they can engage in all kinds of activities ranging from migrant smuggling to fuel theft. And one of the things I really focused on in Morelos that was shocking is the extent of extortion. And it really hits everybody from large sort of sugar refineries down to doctors, shopkeepers, and tortilla shops, which was one of the things that really grabbed my attention. Small shopkeepers are being hit up for money. These crime groups want to finance themselves, and extortion is an easy way to do it. So there's kind of a terror that reigns over some parts of the state, and frankly, it's been getting worse. I think that's something again that people in the U.S. don't always recognize. It can seem like, uh, capos get captured or cartels rise and fall, but everything sort of just keeps running along. And I think in Morelos, actually, the dynamic has really gotten steadily worse to the point where, as I say, it really affects huge amounts of the population.
So, reading your article, it definitely sounds like the security dynamic in Morelos is worrying. And I remember when I first read your article, I really thought it was fascinating, and it was also one of the only times recently that I've seen an English language media outlet publish any type of really in-depth analysis on organized crime activity in Morelos. And while getting ready to do this podcast, I looked for videos on YouTube, and I see that many US based news outlets covered the killing of cartel leader Arturo Beltran Leyva, but I haven't really seen new videos documenting the recent violence and the recent incidents of extortion that have happened since then. And overall, as you said, I think that there's definitely this real lag of perception about the problem of violence in Morelos, and in particular among foreign executives and tourists. And when I look at the news in Spanish language, Mexican media outlets, it seems like many of the shootings in Morelos look like scenes that we're seeing in some of the worst hotspots of organized crime in Mexico, but many visitors still perceive Cuernavaca to be safe. And I recently pulled the statistics on homicides in Morelos, and it's just shocking to see how much the violence has increased over time in Morelos. And I know that in 2024, the number of murders recorded in Morelos was actually 10 times higher than it was in 2007. And I thought that was pretty shocking. And in particular, just during the last 6 years, the violence in Morelos has really reached a new high. And in fact, in 2024, the violence recorded in Morelos was actually the highest ever in modern Mexico's history. In total, Morelos recorded over 1,300 homicides last year, and that was enough to make it one of the top 10 most violent states in Mexico. But it's a small state, and in terms of population adjusted homicide rate or per capita homicide rate, Morelos is actually now the second most violent state in Mexico. And to put it in perspective, Morelos as a whole, as a state, actually has a homicide rate now that is 3 times higher than Chicago's murder rate and 15 times higher than New York City's homicide rate. And that to me kind of speaks on the overall level of violence, but at the local level, we see that the crime taking place goes well beyond shootings. And as you mentioned, extortion is a very big problem for the private sector at the local level in Morelos. And I wanted to ask, why do you think it is that Morelos has become such a challenging location for tortilla makers in particular?
Yeah, what you say about Cuernavaca still being seen as this kind of lovely place where people from Mexico City drive for a lovely Sunday lunch. There that's still true in part, but I was struck when I went back to Cuernavaca after not having been there for a while. I drove down one of the main streets to get into the city, and there was a big banner overhead that read, if we catch criminals, we beat them up. I mean, one of these neighborhoods was so outraged by the amount of robbery that literally, I mean, there were signs up. I think that really, to understand what happened in Morelos, you do have to look back at what you mentioned, the era in which one gang, one cartel, the Beltran Leybas, really controlled what was going on in Morelos. And with that killing of Arturo Beltran Leyva, around 15 years ago or so, the gang split into a variety of groups. And this is something we've seen really at the national level as well. So you see that these smaller groups are not necessarily able to engage in international drug trafficking, but they need money, and often they're fighting each other. So they kind of prey on the local population, and extortion is one of the uh, primary activities. Now, tortillerias are really easy picking. You find them in practically every neighborhood in Mexico, obviously, including Morelos. They're very accessible. They tend to use cash. And so you now have a problem where um, uh, thousands of tortillerias around the country are being extorted, and people are raising their voice somewhat, I should say, because there's a lot of fear about reporting crime gangs. But in Morelos, the head of the state Tortilleria Owners Association was one of the people who has really denounced what's going on. And so that was one of the reasons I went to Morelos, and I was kind of shocked. I mean, he introduced me to, for example, a colleague who had a tortilleria, had refused to pay extortion. A gang set it on fire, and this guy was now trying to flee the country. I mean, he was desperate because he didn't think he could stay in Morelos. And he spoke to me. It was almost, it was all, in a backyard. It was kind of secret, and I couldn't use his name, of course. I mean, it was just to think that these are tortilla makers who are now in this situation where literally their lives can be in danger if they don't pay up, right? And you do see that these gangs will set tortillas on fire. They will riddle them with gunfire if they don't pay. So it is a really tough place for the tortilla makers, and as other states are as well. And one other thing I would point out is that the pressure on the tortilla business goes all the way up the chain. So you see a lot of these little tortilla shops, they grind their own corn, and they often get it from Sinaloa because that state is very famous for its agriculture, particularly corn. And increasingly, what you see there in Sinaloa, from what we were told, is that the dominant cartel, Sinaloa cartel, has gotten involved in the water, the supply of water for irrigation. So essentially, they are they're using their influence to get preference for farmers, or to benefit people who are aligned with the cartel, and then farmers who are not, or not involved in the Sinaloa cartel, have to pay a lot more. And that's just one example. And then you take it all the way down the line. I mean, as the corn is sent to Morelos in trucks, there are gangs that specialize in preying on trucks that carry all kinds of goods. And then, finally, the corn gets to a place like Morelos, and then they face extortion. And in some areas, some parts of Morelos and Guerrero next door, crime gangs have actually taken control of selling the corn, and they force tortillas to buy from them. So it's a whole process that goes all the way up the supply chain, and it's sort of a picture of how this penetration of organized crime goes so deeply.
I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of this is not a sort of nascent trend where a few tortilla makers in Morelos are complaining about this and security analysts are starting to pay attention to it. I really think this is a case where we see organized crime has really deeply penetrated a particular sector and has affected, a number of different aspects of the business, all the way from the corn being brought in and being lost in cargo truck hijackings to the local retail level being affected by intimidation and extortion. And I think it's important to note that we do see industry associations talking about this, and it's possible that in Morelos alone that we're talking about hundreds and perhaps even thousands of businesses being affected by extortion or the threat of extortion. in a context of generalized violence. But at the national level, we're really talking about tens of thousands of tortilla makers dealing with extortion, and that's a pretty significant issue. And it just makes me think about this concept, which is sometimes visitors think about Cuernavaca by its original nickname, which is the city of the eternal spring or Primavera Eterna. And for over a decade and a half, locals have kind of sarcastically referred to their own city as being the place of the Balacera Eterna or the eternal shootout. And I think that kind of reflects how common shootouts, armed robberies, carjackings, and other incidents have become at the local level in Morelos. And I know in my own life, a couple of years ago, I attended a funeral for someone that I knew in Cuernavaca, and it was held at a large funeral home. And I know that in a different part of the facility, there was a wake for a prominent and well-connected local businessman who had been killed. And when I got there at around 10 in the morning, there were some pretty scary looking guys in fancy cowboy boots who were standing out front. And it was pretty clear from the way that people were looking at them that they were cartel sicarios. And people inside the funeral home told me that at night these guys had come in and brought assault rifles and placed the guns by the windows just to be able to defend in case the funeral home was attacked during the night. And that might sound crazy, but there have been a number of incidents where heavily armed cartel commandos have attacked funerals and even hospitals in recent years in Morelos or in Cuernavaca. And when I looked out the window, I saw that there were uniformed police officers who were talking to some of these civilian gunmen. And it just seemed to be a visual example of this idea of a nexus between organized crime, state power, and local business elites. And in the Mexican press, we do see a fair bit of coverage about this issue of extortion affecting local businesses in Morelos, but I'm wondering when it comes to foreign companies or US companies that are investing or operating in Morelos, what's the level of risk?
So, I would put it like if you were to think of sort of red light, yellow light, green light, I would say yellow. I think that from what I've been told by different executives in Mexico, some of the larger companies appear to escape risk since a lot of the extortionists are trying to get to the bosses, and it can be harder with a big company. However, there are reports of companies paying uh, paying off gangs through intermediaries like lawyers or security companies. Um, and I do think these groups are very opportunistic. I think one of the reasons, uh, as you mentioned, in which um, outsiders don't perceive initially the risk of what's going on is that local people are very afraid, I found, to talk about it. So these reports of what's going on don't even necessarily make the media. In Mexico, at one point I went to talk to the Catholic bishop in Morelos, Ramon Castro, and there was sort of a little mini kind of scandal because he had gone to the city of Cuautla, which is around 40 minutes or so from Cuernavaca, and he'd gone for a typical, celebrate mass and engage in normal activities with the faithful and so on. But he had a closed door meeting with different, Catholics involved with the church there. And what he heard from them was just one person after another talking about the vast amount they had to pay to gangs. And he mentioned, for example, the tortillas were being hit with a sort of one-time fee of 50,000 pesos, like $2,500. And trucks that were carrying sugarcane to the local mill, which is a pretty big business there, they had to pay that much. Again, 50,000 pesos, almost $3,000 every time they entered. And the bishop wound up when he returned to Cuernavaca, giving a sermon and denouncing how widespread the extortion was in Cuautla, how practically everybody was getting caught up in it, whether it was a hamburger stand or a doctor's office or whatever. And the fact that he really denounced the level of extortion, it made the front page of national newspapers. And within days of his speech, the person in charge of the truckers at the sugar mill in Cuautla was shot dead. A couple weeks later, someone in the local market, a butcher, was shot dead. The amount of violence is extraordinary. But like I said, finding people to actually talk about their own examples. I had asked the bishop if he could, help recommend me to some people or see if some folks that he had spoken to might tell me their stories, obviously without using their names. And in the end, he said nobody would agree to talk to me. These groups have a huge amount of power, and part of it is that they are seen as being linked to local police, and in some cases linked to politicians as having impunity, really. So that just creates an environment in which people feel like they have no protection.
So I think that's really interesting. It's like obviously we know how serious these problems with organized crime activity and violence are in Morelos, but you still think that it's a yellow light level of risk for US companies or other foreign companies that are operating or investing in Morelos. And I think that's a really important point to make. We know that Morelos is definitely a hotspot for violent carjacking and for violent in-transit cargo truck hijacking. And overall, in general, right now, Mexico is the world's highest risk country for cargo truck hijacking, with over 20,000 violent hijackings happening every year. And in general, the entire area of central Mexico around Mexico City, that includes Michoacan, Puebla, Mexico State, Veracruz, and also Morelos, is really the epicenter of this cargo truck hijacking problem. So it's important to point out that cargo truck hijacking is definitely a serious risk for companies from the US and other countries that are moving trucks on highways in Morelos and in surrounding states. But I definitely think that it's also important to clarify that we don't see stories about major foreign companies suffering from arson attacks, or we don't see stories about local criminal groups starting to specialize in kidnapping foreign executives for ransom in Morelos. And I think that that's a definite contrast to the risks that local entrepreneurs in Cuernavaca and other parts of the state face. And I know that I have met and spoken to locals about the way that crime affects life in Cuernavaca. And once a guy showed me some of the bullet wounds that he has after he was shot during a home invasion at his house. And another woman told me about how when she was younger, she was shot at and pursued in a car chase by armed gunmen during a targeted kidnapping attempt. And I also heard a pretty shocking story about a friend of a friend who was a lawyer who was kidnapped and decapitated after he defended a client who was linked to an organized crime group. And I've also heard random stories about violent armed robberies happening at restaurants at night. And I know there's always stories in the news about shootouts happening in public locations, and I think there's definitely a sense that violent crime is a serious risk in Cuernavaca and other parts of Morelos, even if it's not targeted. And so I think that's a kind of important point to make. It seems like with extortion in particular, these crime groups are really focusing on targeting locals rather than messing around with foreign companies or specifically targeting visiting tourists from the US or other countries. And I think that when it comes to foreign companies, I would look at Morelos and classify it as a low risk state for targeted executive kidnapping or extortion, but I definitely consider it to be a high risk state for companies having their operations or employees affected by random violence, such as carjacking, for instance. And with that in mind, I also wanted to ask you what you think about the way the dynamics on the ground are evolving. And I'm wondering, how do you think that President Sheinbaum's policies compare to former President Lopez Obrador's? Do things seem worse now? Is it more of the same? Or are you seeing some policy changes that you really view as an improvement?
It's interesting because she is trying to describe her policies as a continuation of Lopez Obrador's. He was her political patron, of course, and she doesn't want to look like she's breaking with him. But I think there's a distinct difference. She is emphasizing investigations and use of intelligence more. Her civilian director of security has established his own a force of investigators and police and so on, so that it's not just the army that will be going after organized crime. She does seem very focused, very energetic, and certainly you don't hear her talking about hugs, not bullets, which was the way that AMLO described his own policies, her predecessor, Lopez Obrador. I think she is taking a more confrontational attitude toward crime groups. But I think that there's a lot of questions. She still spends relatively little on security. Mexico has one of the percentage spent on security forces is one of the lowest in the OECD. And that's not changing very much. Mexico is in a bit of a budget crunch right now. AMLO left Sheinbaum with rather a high fiscal deficit. So you're not seeing a big increase in security spending. And I don't yet see really strong signs of a broader effort to tackle impunity. You don't see, for example, in the justice system, reforms that might strengthen the system. There is a judicial reform underway, but it's to elect judges, a lot of the federal judges and state judges, rather than have them appointed in a civil service exercise. And it's just not clear, I think, that that will actually improve investigations, convictions, and so on. So I think she's trying to crack down more on crime groups, but whether she can go after what is the more entrenched problem, whether she's willing to do that, I don't know. And one of the issues is that she has remained really a staunch ally of the former governor, Cuauhtemoc Blanco, who left office several months ago. Now, he was accused by many people of, or seen as having questionable ties to organized crime groups. There was at one point in the local media kind of a bombshell report in which he was photographed with some known crime gang leaders. Now, he said he didn't know they were crime leaders, but the crime levels did rise significantly under Blanco, and his party essentially did little about these accusations, and in fact presented him for a seat in Congress. So there's been allegations about corruption, sexual abuse, possible gang ties, and investigations even opened against him at the state level. But his party has stood by him, including Sheinbaum.
So I think you made some really great points right there. And I think that we're definitely in a moment right now where President Sheinbaum is still, only halfway through her first year in office. And we still have to wait and see a little bit what kind of impact her policies will have. But even early on, there are definitely some questions about how much money she really is willing to spend on improving the quality of police investigative capacity in Mexico. Um, and I know that I recently spoke to the Council on Foreign Relations, Will Freeman. He told me that when he looks at the Cuatro T era security strategy in Morelos, he would give it an F, a straight up failure. And he did clarify that mostly that grade belongs to Lopez Obrador, but he's still waiting to see what Sheinbaum actually ends up doing in Morelos. And I definitely think you mentioned Cuauhtémoc Blanco, and I think that one of the biggest tests for Sheinbaum's administration will be whether or not she chooses to pursue serious investigations into the corruption allegations that exist at the local level, and whether or not Cuauhtémoc Blanco and other politicians in Morelos are working directly with organized crime groups. And as I said, Sheinbaum does say that she wants to invest more in police intelligence and investigations, but we haven't really seen her make a major new push to hire or train more professional police in places like Morelos. And something that's really important to point out is right now, Morelos is actually the worst state in Mexico in terms of the rate of impunity. And overall, around 99.8% of all of the murders that take place in Morelos go unsolved. And that is an insane statistic. To put it differently, right now, the police and prosecutors in Morelos are basically solving almost none of the murders that are happening in the state. And as I said, I think I definitely agree with you with the idea that there's still a lot of questions about how much political will there really is, both within the Sheinbaum administration and at the local level in Morelos when it comes to really tackling fighting crime and corruption. And with that in mind, one other thing I want to ask is there any real lesson or takeaway from your reporting and research in Morelos that you would hope that Scheinbaum's government is taking note of?
I would just say that this is not, Mexico's not a steady state. If there is not um, an effort to really frustrate crime, it'll get worse. In Morelos, you can see the tortilla makers talk to me about how their big problem started 3 years ago, and it started with, they were being asked to pay maybe $10 a week to protect the neighborhood and so on, right? And so a lot of them paid up and felt like, okay, I can handle this. But now they are being hit up for like 20,000 pesos a month. I mean, like 900, $1,000. I mean, things get worse if there's not this is not just a situation in which it's kind of one drug dealer or drug kingpin after another who gets arrested and the next one pops up. There when there's a void, it does get filled by crime actors. I would say one perhaps hopeful sign I would end with is in a different state, Tamaulipas, where you have a massive problem of oil theft, and it costs the government. This is something that costs the government billions of dollars a year and involves sneaking in basically oil, different kinds of gas and oil over the border from the United States. It's been a huge problem. It's gotten very little attention, and there are clear signs that the business is linked to legal business people and to politicians, including some that have favored Morena. But you are seeing now a crackdown there. I think that the Sheinbaum government has been willing to take on both some an illegal business that has benefited some members of their own party, and they're making some big busts and arresting people and working with the U.S. and so on. So I see a sign that there's a recognition of the damage, but I would hope that the administration wouldn't simply be looking at how do we tamp down violence where it's highest, but also looking at where's the penetration of these groups the strongest, because sometimes when the penetration is really strong, there's actually less violence because they're not fighting with rivals, but their control over the population and the terrible effects on daily life uh, in Mexico and influence over politics, over the economy. I mean, real control. That's where you see the really deep fundamental problem that's going to be the very hard one to take on.
So I think that's a great point, and I think that, maybe one of the biggest problems in Morelos is that, according to some security analysts, there are over a dozen different groups that are operating in the state, and that makes it very difficult for um, local entrepreneurs to really buy meaningful protection, even if they are paying extortion payments. And if there are political leaders at the local level who are trying to negotiate directly with these groups in order to reduce the violence, it's just incredibly difficult when there are so many bad actors involved in different operations in the state. And I do think that even though there are so many very serious trends happening at the local level in Morelos, there's definitely also some reason for optimism when we look at Sheinbaum and her track record in reducing violent crime and in improving police investigations in Mexico City. Previously, she had been the mayor of Mexico City. But I also think that it's not really clear if the Mexico City model can be applied in Morelos. And we know that Mexico City has by far the highest number of state police officers of any state in Mexico. And right now, there are over 92,000 state police officers in Mexico City. And in contrast, there are only 2,000 state police in Morelos. And to put that differently, right now, Morelos has only around 2% as many state police as Mexico City. So it seems like if Cuernavaca is going to follow Mexico City's example of increasing police patrols and reducing violence, President Sheinbaum is really going to need to work with the state government in Morelos to make a huge investment in building up the local police. And I think that right now what we're seeing in Morelos might be what we see in some other states in Mexico, which is what happens when a powerful organized crime group splinters apart and diversifies into new rackets. And if there's any big takeaway for me, it's that over the last 6 years, we've seen that this strategy of trying to reach deals for peace with criminal groups hasn't really worked out at all in Morelos. And now we're going to have to watch and see if Scheinbaum's strategy of focusing on police investigations and intelligence is really going to have an impact. And again, I just want to close by saying that I really think that your article is absolutely one of the best examples I've seen of coverage of the current problems in Morelos in the last few years. And I definitely would encourage listeners, if they haven't read it, to check it out. And I know that you recently won an Overseas Press Club award for this article. So I just want to say congrats on that too. And finally, I just want to say thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Nate. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you like what you heard in the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.